Please sit down. We'll get on with the next panel. And behold the name of the panel, the title. It's called Rescuing, Deepening, and Promoting Democracy. So out of the gloom of the early morning panels, we have a bit of hope. This is the optimists panel. So pessimists, please leave the room quietly. This is only forward-looking, always only positive, and we're looking forward to it. On our panel, we have four fantastic speakers and individuals. We have Dr. Sasha Prieve, who's the Director of Collections and Public Programs at the Aga Khan Museum. He's a senior fellow at Massey, so he knows Massey well. He's also the president of ICOM Canada, the International Council of Museums, the Canada branch, and the co-founder of the North American Cultural Diplomacy Initiative. He also teaches and holds appointments both at U of T and at Queen's. And he'll speak to us on cultural institutions and civic engagement. And following Sasha, we'll have Sabrina Dellin, who's also a senior fellow at Massey. She's the CEO of Samara Center for Democracy, which is a charity focused on protecting and strengthening Canadian democracy. So I feel like there's insights that we'll be able to get from her on this. She's appeared as an expert witness before parliamentary committees on matters relating to political participation. She also writes for media outlets on democratic engagement. She's hosted a podcast with House of Commons parliamentarians, which has been very, very well reviewed. And she's the recipient of a Coronation Medal for services to Canada. And she'll present some insights from a project that I think they're currently conducting, online toxicity and abuse in the election context, the bad news, along with the silver lining. Following Sabrina, we have Dr. Shauna Glennon, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ottawa Public Law Center. By the way, it's the best law school in Canada. It happens to be, uncoincidentally, where I went to law school. And she's part of a project there examining unwritten constitutionalism in the UK, Canada, and Germany. She's an expert on the role of citizen deliberation in legislative or constitutional processes, including institutions such as citizens' assemblies and the power that those institutions have to push new ideas forward. Before her career in academia, she practiced public and administrative law at an international law firm in Dublin. And she'll present on citizens' assemblies and deliberative democracy, Ireland's abortion law reform, a case study. And then last but not least, we have George Takash, who is a recovering tech lawyer and is now a senior fellow at the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary History at the University of Toronto. He's the author of the recent, and I could add, wonderful book, Cold War 2.0, Artificial Intelligence in the New Battle Between China, Russia, and America. And he holds a graduate degree on international relations and a bachelor's degree in history, political economy, and philosophy. He'll present on the use and role of AI, the risks and the opportunities. So without further ado, let me ask Sasha to come up.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, and good afternoon. Good afternoon. Just checking if you're still awake. I know it's been a heavy going and a wonderful day, and I'd like to thank Peter very much for the invitation to speak and also for your absolutely marvelous job at getting us all together on this fantastic gathering today. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to actually pick up on the line that Peter had in his remarks. He talked about, in the more policy-oriented end to his remarks, about arming the defenses of the democratic immune system. Hope I got this quote right. And I do like a medical metaphor when I talk about these sort of topics. And I think that's very much what I'd like to talk about in relation to cultural institutions, especially about museums, which I know best. Because I do think they have a substantial role to play in preventing backsliding and strengthening our democracy. Now, why focus on museums? They are often the first ones under pressure because they are the sites of our collective memory as manifested in things, in our cultural and natural heritage. And they're often, because of this, highly contested sites, because it depends then on who controls the narrative of our past, the narrative of our present, and the narrative about how we shape the future. And they're also always places of education. I mean, they were established through a civilizing mission to civilize and educate the unwashed masses back in the 19th century. And so they hold a tremendous sway of the way in which who gets access to a certain narrative about the societies that we live in. So they are very often at the forefront of some of these discussions. Now, I'm not going to rehearse the many places around the world where museums and cultural institutions have been under fire and at times increasingly under control. The examples abound, and we have seen institutions coming under close ideological control of government, directors being replaced, funding redirected or more directed towards government-aligned priorities. History has been rewritten through what's being displayed in museums, and that led actually to the International Council of Museum unusually to put out a report a few years ago about alarming levels of political interference in museums. This was at a time when in Poland, museum directors were being replaced to fit the government at the time. And for a body like ICOM, which is a global standard-setting body for museums, that is a big tent body for museums that includes institutions from all across the world, all jurisdictions, all types of, under all sort of types of regimes, for them to actually take a stance on the matter when they're supposed to delivering a big tent narrative for all museums. It's quite a tremendous move. But in this talk, I will focus more on maybe not rescuing, but maybe more promoting democracy. We'll see where we land with this, but the way in which museums and to that extent also cultural institutions can do prior to backsliding, how we can set ourselves up as institutions and also as audiences and visitors to those institutions to and thereby encourage our institution to take an active role in the business of what I call prevention. I like to talk about museums being part of the prevention, not necessarily the pill. And I start with some encouraging numbers for museums and why it matters to engage with and through cultural institutions. It's because they tend to be highly trusted and have become even more so since the pandemic. As you can see on the right-hand slide of this graph, these are institutions that are less trusted. These are NGOs, regular media, government, and so on. And these are pre-COVID numbers. Sure, these numbers have not improved since for government and elsewhere, but museums have consistently been high on the trust side of things. Generally, cultural institutions, visitor-serving institutions have been highly trusted, and that's been shown again and again across the United States, in the UK, more recently in Germany, but also in Canada. And it's because museums and cultural institutions are seen as credible source of information. And I must say, this is not an extraordinary starting position from which to build a way of prevention backsliding from protecting democracy. So I see in that way museums having a tremendous role in promoting values such as pluralism, freedom of expression, and social cohesion, all aimed at creating a solid and resilient social fabric. The question is, could these institutions become active and proactive guardians of democratic ideals and help foster an informed, engaged, and resilient public? Let me now go to 7 moves that, upon each of which I will briefly touch, that might put these institutions into positions. I'll start with the promotion of critical thinking. As I said earlier, museums are primarily education institutions. Just by the number of school visits and post-secondary collaborations that are happening. And this form of informal education outside of the classroom has a tremendous transformative impact on the students. And museum education has come a long way to more inquiry-based learning, which has shown to have tremendous impact, not just on the subject matter taught in the museum, but also on things like empathy. So that's been studied, and it's a hugely important role. And we need to lean into this critical educational mission to promote critical thinking. And it goes back to what we've heard previously about stemming mis and disinformation. The second point is the role of museums and cultural institutions writ large to defend artistic and intellectual freedom of expression. And I think the way we work with artists, the way we engage in our platforms for dialogue, I think that's absolutely critical. And it goes with the third point, to provide spaces for dialogue. We are still in many ways seen as relatively safe spaces for certain types of conversations. We need to see what these conversations are and whether this is a trust leveled at us, from everyone. I don't think it is, but certainly providing this space for dialogue is critically important. And it has shown now over I don't know how many decades of intergroup contact theory that the deliberate attempt at bringing groups together at the level playing field has an effect on decreasing prejudice and so on, and engaged and engendering dialogue and different ways of thinking about each other. And I think if museums can take on that role, I think we are set up for the better. And then the fourth point is about the way we think about history and the way we talk about history, the way we historicize developments, and not thinking that the last 3 years or whatever the amount is the current present, be very presentist about what's going on, but actually historicize what's going on and lean into the deep knowledge across, into deep time even at times, to really understand what's been going on in the world. And related to that is facing truth and engaging in reconciliation. I think that's absolutely critical, and I must say that Canada's museum specifically, and I came here from a European context where I know a lot is happening recently in terms of colonial reckoning in the cultural sector. When I came here to Canada, the museums were way ahead, and it's one of the priorities of the sector to really lean into truth and reconciliation. It's about implementing UNDRIP and so on. So it's not imperfect, but there's been a lot of progress. A fifth element of this is to promote civic engagement. And the question is this fostering pluralistic principles and certain form of dialogues? That's certainly part of it, but also museums becoming voting stations, or museums presenting debates of the candidates. So there's a lot of room there to becoming civic sites in this regard, sites for gathering and so on, sites for the AGMs of community organization and so on. All of this feeds into this stream. And another critical point for me is civil society collaboration, collaborating outside of our sector with institutions to drive a common purpose. The more we create these kind of alliances for shared purposes, and as visitor serving institution, always with an audience in mind, an impact in mind, I think this will do us a lot of good. And finally, pet topic, global engagement. I think it's critical not to leave this as sort of a purely domestic lens or internal lens, but also think globally in terms of our work. This is about embracing, thinking through global challenges and the way these have local manifestations, but also fostering and deepening international collaboration, working across civil societies and also across jurisdiction where civil societies might not be that strong or non-existent, but still working across borders to a shared purpose. Now, if I stopped here, that would all be reasonably optimistic, reasonably feasible. But I would like to talk about a few variables that make a life a little bit difficult to get there. Don't want to leave on a kumbaya-ish note here. Because none of this work is easy. It requires a lot of conscious effort. It requires a lot of investment and commitment on institutions. Bringing groups together in a space to do certain things together is something that is hard to do and hard to do at scale, and needs to be carefully done so that you achieve the results that you want, whether it's creating a dialogue between groups that don't always be a dialogue, or and so on. And so we need to this requires this level of investment and staffing and so on, and really a commitment to this. It's very hard to do. And then in some areas, institutions might be more willing to do work than others, or more willing to be comfortable. And actively and proactively talking about expressing a purpose with regard to safeguarding democracy might not seem natural to all institutions. It might be seen as maybe a too political way of looking at oneself. Some institutions, like presidential libraries or house museums where an important political figure lived, memorials and so on, for them it's often much easier to do because they come imbued with this kind of purpose. But other museums, can they read themselves in this work? What about your Natural History Museum? Would they actively read themselves into that work? They're comfortable talking about climate change. Well, maybe not longer, but they used to be quite comfortable talking about climate change and biodiversity. Would they be talking about democracy as well, or would they find proxies to talk about it? I think that's really critical, whether there's enough of a commitment from the sector. But I think the biggest hurdle is what I would call the myth of neutrality. Museums like to see themselves as neutral institutions. Eminent museum scholar, Canadian museum scholar Bob Janes called it that museums rest on the notion of authoritative neutrality, which means a permission to not engage, a permission to see anything that resembles engagement as too political. But when you talk to groups that are not reflected in the main narratives that museums foster, in the groups that are included from those narratives, for them museums have been political all along. There's no secret to that museums, every decision made in a museum is a political decision. What to display, what not to display, how to shape narratives, which voices to include, which voices to exclude, which artists to work with, artists not to work with. These are all political choices, and they're certainly not neutral. But it has been a level of comfort and safety to rest on the myth of neutrality. Would then, logically, a heightened sense of safeguarding democracy be seen as a political effort rather than a vital effort to safeguard where we are as a society? I think it's more useful to say we're not partisan institution, not at all partisan, but to embrace the political animals that we are, and thereby be very aware and conscious of decisions that we make. I think there's a much more comfortable position to be in rather than a defensive position. And then I'd like to conclude with a problem of time. When I look at the time horizons that are being bandied about for the rearmament of Europe, we hear 5 years, we have 10 years, we need at least 5 years for sure. Well, all of this museum work, the armament of museums in defense of democracy, well, that takes time horizon as well. To build the reflexes, to build the coalitions, to build even the general willingness to go there takes a long time to achieve. So it's not something where we can just do a program tomorrow and then hope it will have the impact. It will take time. We'll need to be evaluated and tested and evolved, and it needs to be done at scale to reach as many people as we can. So this is certainly a factor. And we've seen in COVID that cultural institutions can step up to the plate when there's a crisis, that they have provided us with a sense of connection through culture. So there is a way of responding to crisis, to retooling the way we act in the world. I'm not going all the way down to Zoom concerts and things like that, but there was a way of service provision that responded to the crisis. But how about thinking about the time before crisis actually hits? And to set ourselves up with mechanisms of prevention and not wait it out until we're actually in a situation of crisis. And I'd like to leave it with that. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. That was kind of a bit sad. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. All right, so good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank Peter, CIC, and Massey College for bringing us together today and for the invitation to speak on this panel. I also want to recognize our friends and partners at Ideas. We work together with them at the Samara Center for an annual lecture called In Defense of Democracy. And next week, our new partnership, Ideas for a Better Canada, is going to air. That's a cross-country series where we went to public libraries across the country and talked about what's working in our democracy. So please tune in for that. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through some of the recent research we've done at the Samara Center about how technology is influencing our democracy. We know there's lots to be worried about. We covered that today. But I'm going to share some pro-social and pro-democracy ways forward as well. So first, just a bit of background. The Samara Center for Democracy is a nonpartisan registered charity. We produce research, events, podcasts, and educational materials that are all aimed at strengthening Canada's democracy. We were founded in 2007, and our mission is to realize a vibrant culture of civic engagement across the country. Our work is organized around three pillars: the lived experience of politics, youth civic engagement, and how technology is shaping our democratic culture, which is the focus of my remarks today. So in 2021, we launched our SAMBOT project, which measures online abuse received by candidates in Canadian elections on X, formerly Twitter. To date, we've monitored a dozen elections, tracked the experience of over 1,500 candidates, and analyzed over 4 million tweets. Our latest report came out a few months ago, and it examined the 2023 Alberta election. And here we found that just a small percentage of users was responsible for a disproportionate amount of the abuse that we tracked. This small group is skewing online political conversations and making them more abusive and less representative of the views of actual Canadians. We also found evidence of potentially widespread inauthentic engagement in the form of what may be bot accounts. However, we know AI-generated content is increasingly more and more sophisticated and accessible, making it hard to distinguish between what's real and isn't real online. We also found that discussions regarding LGBTQ+ rights garnered heightened online engagement and abuse. This is a worrying finding that we've observed in other Canadian elections as well. And finally, we found that it's not just high-profile candidates that receive vitriol online. Political newcomers face their share of abuse as well. First-time candidates received high levels of abusive content relative to incumbents. And this is important because it indicates that candidates can expect abuse as a condition of work from the very beginning of their political careers. This has serious implications on representation, recruitment, and retention in our politics. Verified is our new broader tech and democracy project, and this is an evolution from that SAMBOT work. In a time when Canadian democracy is increasingly at risk from digital mis- and disinformation, we know that voters need help understanding how Canadian politics are playing out online. Over the course of the election, we're monitoring Blue Sky, Reddit, and YouTube, and sharing reports that are aimed at helping the electorate understand what's misleading, what's real, and where they should be cautious. We're also sharing information on the places where positive civic conversation and engagement are happening online so we can be supportive of these spaces. We've published 2 verified reports so far, both focused on Reddit in the earliest days of the election. This is an important platform when it comes to online political conversations because of recent changes to the online news landscape in Canada, particularly the Meta news ban. So you can share news on Reddit. r/Canada is the largest Canadian subreddit with over 3.7 million members. A lot of people read subreddits without being members, so the reach is actually much wider than that. To give you a sense of scale and proportion here, globally, this subreddit is number 227. Number 226 is r/Taylor Swift. In our first report, we found a small number of users on r/Canada, are having an outsized influence on the discussion. So this is a similar finding to that Sambot Alberta work. We saw that 150 most active commenters made up at least 14% of all comments. It was just 9 users that were producing 28% of posts. Power abusers, this is a term that describes high volume users who post high volumes of abuse, were not prevalent on r/Canada during our tracking. This shows a difference from our previous research on X. This might have to do with the way Reddit handles content moderation. It's a community moderated platform, so abusive content may have been taken down quickly by moderators or users themselves. This is counter to how other platforms do it. Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, and TikTok are largely moderated by platform-owned automated systems. In our second report, we looked at over 56,000 Reddit comments made on r/Canada and found that the discussion was dominated, unsurprisingly, by the Canadian election and Canada-US relations. 38% of all posts or submissions referenced our neighbors to the south. Party leaders were the most common names that showed up. Mark Carney first, Pierre Poilievre second. Interestingly, the top 3 most referenced people in this period were Carney, Poilievre, and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. So Verified presents research and analysis, but we've also put together some resources that can help people feel equipped navigating online political conversations. We know that people are looking for accurate and trustworthy political information. So we've put together this chart that shows you where news can be shared across different digital platforms. And here we're drawing on data from TMU Social Media Lab's report, The State of Social Media in Canada 2025. The clicker is a bit weird. My positive slide is in here. That's weird that it was blocked. Okay, so where do we go from here? It's a period, we will be persistent and get to the positive. Okay, it's a period of global democratic backsliding, but it's also a moment in our country where we're tuning in like never before, and we have deep concerns about the future of our sovereignty and our democratic culture. So how do we leverage this to strengthen our democracy? First, and this has come up today, it's vital to invest in civic education, particularly digital literacy, so people understand how to be discerning across these platforms and know that what they're viewing and reading isn't necessarily reflective of public opinion. It's important to note here, the problem is not a bunch of misinformed Canadians. Voters are contending with information manipulation from very motivated bad actors, from platforms that are presenting themselves as public squares when they're not. Platforms that are sharing content that is overwhelming and making you upset by design, so you feel powerless, like you don't have a voice, and that your vote doesn't matter. Once that civic connection is severed, it's incredibly hard to restore. This leads to the spread of misinformation amongst the public. And in this context, it's never been more urgent to take a longer-term view and have a generational lens onto how we support and equip voters to be navigating digital spaces online. Politicians also need to be tuned into this because they are also online a lot, and they need to understand that what they're seeing isn't necessarily reflecting where their constituents are at. To make good policy, we need good information. And if politicians are only reacting to what they're seeing online, that's not in our interest. We also need to ensure that we aren't only online. We need to have in-person conversations with our family, our friends, neighbors, candidates, elected officials. We need to talk about where everyone is getting their information from and where we're at when it comes to different issues. And certainly opportunities to come together today like this matter, and we can feel that. Finally, the biggest structural piece is platform regulation, and those above 2 points, civic education and actually talking and not just being online all the time, can drive this in an informed way. This entails incentivizing platform design for pro-social, pro-democracy behavior. This means thinking beyond content moderation. It's about centering social cohesion on platforms and encouraging experimentation so we can test and implement what works best. In 2021, a Washington Post article explained how Facebook's algorithm prioritized angry reactions. An angry face emoji was given 5 points, while neutral or positive reactions received lower scores. This pushed the angry content into user feeds, skewing public perception. What if we did the opposite? What if we didn't promote the content that made us upset and overwhelmed? What if there were more nuanced options for reactions, like just a simply respect button? So I've got 2 examples here of groups that are leading the way with testing and experimenting for pro-social, pro-democracy ways that we can harness the positive aspects of digital platforms, connection and information sharing. So this is the Council on Technology and Social Cohesion and the Pro-Social Design Network. This work also underscores how democracy is something we actively do and not something we passively have. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks to my co-panelists for teeing everyone up. So we've heard a lot today about the challenges that democracies are facing. We've been reading about it in the media, we've been looking at it in the literature, we've been talking about it today. We're hearing about democratic decline, democratic backsliding, democratic degradation, constitutional rot. And it's true, democracies are facing big challenges. But it's also true that democracies around the world are not standing still either. And we are seeing across the globe, oh, Sabrina, you're right, the slides are a little funny. Here we are. We are seeing across the globe now, over the past couple of decades, a rise of democratic innovations that seek to engage ordinary citizens and give ordinary people a more meaningful role in making policy, law, collective decisions. And one type of these innovations that our keynote speaker touched on earlier is the deliberative mini-public. What is a deliberative mini-public? Essentially, this is a representative sample of ordinary citizens who are chosen by lot, they don't have any special qualifications, who deliberate together on a particular legal or policy topic, and they make recommendations for reform. And the OECD has reported a wave of these types of deliberative citizen bodies around the world over the past 20 years or so. And what country has been kind of a trailblazer in this regard? Ireland. Ireland has taken a really leading role on the international stage in trying to meaningfully incorporate deliberative mini-publics, usually in the form of citizens' assemblies, into its constitutional and legal reform processes. One scholar has described Ireland as the jewel in the crown of deliberative democracy. So this idea that we can make our decisions in a more deliberative and inclusive way by empowering citizens to have a role. But I suppose the question arises, this all sounds great in paper, how do deliberative mini-publics actually work? Can they really enhance our democracies? Can they actually impact real, tangible legal changes in a concrete way? And I'm going to talk to you about one such concrete example of the use of a deliberative mini-public, in this case a citizens' assembly, in an incredibly significant legal reform in Ireland, which is the reform of the law on abortion. Now, to give you a little bit of background, in the early 1980s, the Irish people voted overwhelmingly by way of referendum to insert a new provision into our constitution, commonly referred to as the Eighth Amendment. And this provision, for the first time, provides for a right to life of the unborn, constitutional protection for the unborn. Ireland was the first country in the world to enshrine this into its constitution. Now, you'll see that I've put the wording of the provision up on the slide. The state acknowledges the right to life of the unborn, with due regard to the equal right to life of the mother, guarantees to defend, as far as practicable, that right. It doesn't mention abortion, it doesn't mention termination of pregnancy, but it was interpreted in quite a restrictive way by the courts over the years. Now, after the insertion of this provision into our constitution, political actors really took a step back. There was a lot of inertia around this. No legislation or policy was enacted to specify the circumstances when, if ever, abortion could be performed lawfully in Ireland. The whole process around this referendum was incredibly polarising. It was described by the Irish Times in an editorial at the time as the second partitioning of Ireland. Such was the division that it caused. And so, in the face of legislative inertia, it eventually fell to the Irish Supreme Court in one of the most notorious cases in Irish history, the X case, to interpret the wording of the Eighth Amendment in the context of a very tragic case concerning a 14-year-old girl who was pregnant as a result of being raped and was injuncted from leaving the country by the Attorney General at the time in the name of defending the right to life of the unborn. And the Supreme Court in that case was very critical of Parliament for not having enacted any legislation or guidance around abortion in Ireland, but it interpreted the Constitution to mean that abortion could only be lawfully performed in Ireland in the case of a real and substantial risk to the life of the pregnant woman. So very restrictive, very high bar. Now, of course, the reality on the ground was that this Eighth Amendment, this provision, which was perceived as a bar to abortion in almost all circumstances, did not prevent abortion in Ireland from taking place. Of course, it did take place, and it took place through people travelling where they had the means to be able to travel, and in later years, importing abortion pills and taking them in the absence of medical supervision. So, following on from the X case, there was a number of further constitutional referendums. This issue kept on going before the courts at both national level and European level, and slowly momentum began to build for a change to the law. But it was really the death of a young pregnant woman named Savita Halappanavar in 2012 that ignited the movement for change. Savita Halappanavar was pregnant with a much-wanted pregnancy, but became unwell, was admitted to hospital experiencing a miscarriage, and ultimately died of sepsis. And her death was widely blamed on the chilling effect of the Eighth Amendment on medical practitioners, this reluctance to intervene at the risk of harming the life of the unborn. And so it soon became clear to the political establishment that they couldn't step away from this subject anymore. Reform was in the air, the people were taking to the streets. And what was on the agenda for reform? Well, really, a lot of the discourse in the media and the public was about these hard cases. What if the pregnancy is posing a risk to the health of the pregnant woman, like Savita? What about pregnancy arising from rape or incest? What about cases where a diagnosis has been made of a fetal abnormality? You all thought you were at the optimistic panel and you wouldn't be hearing about such terrible things. But these were the kinds of things that were in the public discourse. Abortion in Ireland was not available in any of these scenarios unless the life of the pregnant person was at risk. And so the Irish government took the somewhat novel step in 2016 of establishing a citizens' assembly. And this was greeted by some scepticism on people both against reform and in favour of reform. And this was described as an exercise in deliberative democracy, placing the citizen at the heart of important legal and policy issues facing Irish society. What was the Citizens' Assembly? It was 99 ordinary citizens that were broadly representative of Irish society who came together. The first topic they were given was the subject of abortion. Now, they came together, they were chaired by a retired Supreme Court judge, they had the benefit of an expert advisory group and a secretariat. They heard from experts, medical, legal, ethical, on the impact of the law, and they had the opportunity to deliberate, discuss, weigh, offer reasons with each other to come up with how the law should be reformed. And it released its report. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it recommended taking the Eighth Amendment out of the Constitution, this constitutional protection for the unborn. They recommended replacing it with a new constitutional provision that would empower Parliament to legislate for abortion. But then they went further. They made detailed recommendations on what a new framework for abortion should look like. We're approaching this. We haven't had lawful abortion in Ireland. This is the first time. So the Citizens' Assembly produced this detailed framework. And surprisingly, instead of focusing on abortion, providing for abortion access in those hard cases we mentioned earlier, they made a very unexpected recommendation. They said we should have an unrestricted right of access to abortion within a certain gestational period, which was 12 weeks. Now, the subject or the topic or the prospect of Ireland having an unrestricted right of access to abortion simply had not been on the agenda, and it caused ripples of surprise among the political establishment when this recommendation was made. Following on from the Citizens' Assembly, its report was given to a cross-parliamentary committee made up of parliamentarians from all parties in the Parliament. And they considered the Citizens' Assembly's recommendations, and they broadly endorsed the spirit of those recommendations. They said, yes, we should repeal the Eighth Amendment, and we should permit pregnancy within the first trimester without restriction as to reason. The referendum was ultimately held in May of 2018. The government went broadly with the thrust of what the Citizens' Assembly and in turn the Parliamentary Committee had recommended, and it passed by a landslide majority. It actually passed by the same majority that the referendum in the early 1980s to put in the right to life of the unborn had passed, a 2/3 majority. So new legislation was introduced by the end of that year, and it included this, by Irish standards, radical proposal of having an unrestricted right of access within the first 12 weeks. So how did the Citizens' Assembly play a part in this reform? Well, there are a couple of features of the process that I'll touch on very briefly that I think helped to contribute to this citizen process making an impact. The first was the approach to the learning phase. Now, abortion in Ireland, I can't stress enough, had not been debated in a very civilised way in Ireland right up until 2016. So the chair of the Citizens' Assembly, this retired Supreme Court Justice Mary Laffoy, had some important decisions to make at the outset. And she decided we are not going to have a traditional punch-up between pro-life and pro-choice voices. That's not how I'm going to structure this. We're going to first have a learning phase for the citizens where we invite experts who have not previously identified themselves as being pro-life or pro-choice, but nonetheless experts who can give the citizens a neutral grounding in the state of the law and what it means. And after that, we will bring in the advocacy groups and we will bring in the public submissions. The second notable feature of this process was the level of input that the citizen participants had. One thing that was missing from the work programme of the Citizens' Assembly at the beginning was the voices of women and girls, people who had actually been affected by the law. And the citizens gave that feedback. They said, we want to hear, we've heard from experts, we want to hear from some women who had to travel, who had to go to England, or who couldn't travel, or who decided not to travel, or who didn't have the means to travel. So that was then incorporated into the work programme, and they were given those perspectives and experiences. And we had some chat earlier about, achieving consensus and, meaningful disagreements as we're trying to make collective decisions. And the citizens in this case also had an important role in preparing the ballots. So a deliberative process is not about getting to the end and saying we've 99 people who all agree, because of course we will legitimately disagree with the best information to hand. We can still disagree with each other. But the citizens still needed to have recommendations to hand over to government. And so the citizens themselves got to have an input into the ballots, not to achieve a consensus, but to ensure that each citizen could vote on the measure that they wanted to vote for and that their preferences were reflected in those ballots. The other important feature of this process was the design. The Citizens' Assembly's recommendations I mentioned were passed on to a parliamentary committee in what some political science scholars have described as a process of designed coupling. So we can have a fantastic citizen process, but if it just sits there and it's not plugged into empowered decision-making sites, then that's all it will be. It'll be a really good process of deliberation that doesn't have an impact. Now, this particular parliamentary committee had parliamentarians that were very much in favour of changing the law, very much against changing the law, that were very much open-minded. But regardless of the position they took going in, they ended up debating the matter within the parameters as set by the Citizens' Assembly. Instead of having a blue sky discussion about abortion, and we had many expert committees and parliamentary groups over the years that tried to tackle this issue that bumped up against a brick wall, Instead, the reform at stake was that put forward by the Citizens' Assembly, a new regime built around an unrestricted right of access within the first 12 weeks, like many countries in Western Europe. When the matter came firmly back to the government to decide how to proceed, when it called the referendum, it presented policy heads to the public. It said, if you vote yes, we undertake that this is how we will legislate for abortion. And there was the 12-week proposal that had emanated from the Citizens' Assembly. With some tweaks, the government added in a 3-day waiting period that had not been recommended by the Citizens' Assembly and was the product of some political horse trading and certain members of government who were a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of going from basically a restriction on abortion to an unrestricted right of access. But nonetheless, the broad bones of the Citizens' Assembly scheme were there for all to see in advance of voting. And sure enough, after the referendum passed, we have our new legislative framework from the end of 2018, incorporating the core recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly with some of those tweaks that I've mentioned. And so, let's come to the end here. What can we say about the impact of the Citizens' Assembly in this case? What can we draw from this as we look at innovative ways to involve citizens in the future, not just in Ireland, in Canada and elsewhere? Well, the Irish Abortion Citizens' Assembly I describe it as a tool of consensus clarification. So deliberative mini-publics are not going to create a consensus out of nowhere. But if, as in the Irish case, there is a consensus that something needs to be done, but perhaps not a consensus on how to do it, a Citizens' Assembly can clarify that consensus into a concrete framework that is capable of attracting cross-party political support. In this way, we can see deliberative mini-publics as having potential to be legislative agenda setters. And I would add, particularly in the Irish case, and I think in other cases as well, institutional design is key to impact. And we saw that in this case through the connection of the Citizens' Assembly to the government by way of this parliamentary committee. Finally, we're here in the Canadian context. We're looking at ways to rejuvenate democracy here. And of course, the Irish experience of incorporating citizens' assemblies into its democratic process was inspired by the Canadian citizens' assemblies back in 2004 and 2006, which looked at electoral reform. And of course, there have been further experimentation in Canada and perhaps on a smaller scale in the years since with citizens' assemblies. But I think there's certainly a case for reinvigorating the discussion around this, particularly when we look at metrics. Perhaps Canada's not in danger of democratic backsliding or sliding into authoritarianism tomorrow. But we still have our challenges. We can see low public confidence in institutions. We can see trust issues. We can see disinformation, some of the things that my co-panelists have been speaking about. And the Irish experience has really shown us that citizens are capable of more than perhaps we might give them credit for. They're not only capable of deliberating on, very broad, wide constitutional values, but also technical policy matters, from technical policy matters on legislating for a brand new legal regime on abortion to complicated things like electoral systems. We certainly have a raft of areas in Canada that we could do with looking at that have perhaps proved intractable through the existing processes. Why don't we let citizens have a chance to do more than simply voting once every few years? I'm going to leave it there, and thank you so much for your attention.
I want to start by adding my own thanks to Peter for a marvelous, the idea for this, and then his talk this morning. Now, Peter, your background's Hungarian? So Peter and I share a mutual background in Hungary, our parents, presumably grandparents. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. His last name, Bíró, means judge or umpire in a soccer game. So you shouldn't be surprised at the quality and the thoughtfulness of his talk this morning, because from the age of 18 months, his parents, his family, his friends, they all called him judge, right? So the rule of law is in Peter's DNA, and we saw that absolutely wonderfully this morning. So he read my book, Cold War 2.0, and he said he liked it, but he said, it's pretty dark, George, and I'm doing this conference on democracy, could you come and talk about AI, but you have to be a little bit upbeat. So in the title, I didn't just say the word peril, I also used the word promise. So that's the last upbeat thing you'll probably hear from me. Oh, I went to this little law school just around the corner. It's not Ottawa U, but it'll have to do for today. Listen, a couple of background words on AI. And if you think conceptually about what Canada's facing, and it feels a little bit like sort of the fall of 1939. We're not quite in the Second World War. Trump has been told, stop talking 51st state, because every time you say that, Carney's numbers go up, and if you want Poilievre, cool it, at least till the day after the election. So we've had a bit of a lull, but if you think, again, conceptually about what Canada's looking at, we have our own democracy challenges, which we've talked about today, but we're also under attack by the United States. And then we've got this AI flooding in. So it's really, if you're into three-dimensional chess, I know Trump is into four-dimensional chess, but if you're into three-dimensional chess from the original Star Trek, that's what we're looking at, I believe, absolutely. And particularly the first two, the democracy challenge and then a very big neighbor challenging your very sovereignty. We've talked about a number of very useful analogs today, Brazil, South Africa, so forth. Have a look at Taiwan. I'm actually coming out with another book on Taiwan, a really deep dive. It's a magical place, an exemplary democracy, fantastic civil society, you name it. And it is very much having fought two battles. They won the battle for democracy, and how they did that and how they're doing that is quite a tale. And of course, now, they're fighting against a huge neighbor that wants to own them. So keep Taiwan on your radar screen. Just a couple of words about AI itself. How many of you, quick show of hands, are using ChatGPT or another AI daily? So I'm going to shame the rest of you. I'm not going to get you to stand. But seriously, go home today, get on either Chat. The one I'm using a lot recently, it's still free, and you can use it a lot for free, is Perplexity. But whichever one you want to get on one and start to get comfortable with it. Because this is really the promise of AI. Imagine if you're a scientist and you've got Albert Einstein right beside you, or you're a medical practitioner and you've got, Osler beside you, the greats of that profession. Or if you're in the legal profession and you've got J.J. Robinette beside you. I mean, the future through AI, and I think Homer Dixon's left, but he'd be shouting at me right now, oh, yeah, more big AI type, rosy futures. You tech guys just don't get it. But seriously, the way I'd put it is, it has the promise, the potential for really being changing, like game changing. And it's not just AI, it's the next point, artificial general intelligence. AI is to AGI what sort of grade 7 math is to a PhD in experimental physics or even theoretical physics. And it's 3 to 5 years away. Chat has actually brought it much closer. When you get onto Chat 5, you'll start to feel a little bit of the AGI vibe, not quite yet, but it's really going to be eye-opening. And there's two types of AI that we have to think about in Canada. One is, I call it AI innovation. So these are these large language models that you've heard about, like ChatGPT or Perplexity or Claude. There are 3 or 4 others, largely American. But the next wave, which is starting now, is AI diffusion, where you take a large language model and you start to apply it to law, to medicine, to engineering, to science, to just about everything. And my messaging is that Canada has to become expert both in AI innovation at the large language model level, but absolutely at the diffusion level, because democracy needs prosperity. And the keynote this afternoon, I really liked the matrix and the economic precarity and so on. I mean, Canada's pressing need for an improvement in productivity and economic output on a sort of global GDP country basis, we are falling so far behind the Americans. And someone said it this morning, democracies tend to be those countries that are in that 90 to 95 percentile range of economic success. This is just basic blocking and tackling. If we can't get AI working for us on the economics, we have a 4th problem beyond the 3 other ones. So democracy needs prosperity, and prosperity increasingly will depend on AI. The other technology, I don't want to start filling your head here late in the day. And I understand, just as you were between us and lunch, I'm between this group, and I'm hoping a cash bar at least in the next room. So I'm going to keep this short. But quantum computing is coming. We actually have a great Canadian player in that, D-Wave, out in Vancouver. But when you add quantum to AI, really the promise of finally a cure for cancer, a cure for dementia, drug discovery, and so on, because quantum matches the physical world. So we've got some great prospects. Okay, this is where it gets dark. The problem that we've got, of course, is US politics. We've talked a lot about that today, Trump and so forth, but also US big tech, because for the most part, the LLMs that we're using, that are taking the world by storm, are American. And my pitch is we need at least 2 Canadian large language model champions. We've got one, Cohere, here in Toronto, raised over $1 billion US in funding so far. They're doing a fascinating joint venture with Royal Bank, sort of AI for financial services, but it can be replicated for others. And in the apps area, the diffusion area, we've got Deep Genomics, $250 million US in funding, again out of Toronto. So we've got the kernel of an AI group of champions, but we need at least one more LLM of that significance, and then we're going to need dozens and dozens of the diffusion players. The one that I'm very worried about is Canadian AI compute. So these are the big data centers that actually house the AI infrastructure. And for instance, the Cohere RBC joint venture is going to be run on an American compute platform, CoreWeave. Bad decision. We need to get a TELUS, a CGI. We need to get Bell and Rogers back into AI infrastructure. We are woefully inadequate. Perhaps some of our pension funds need to step up and put some serious dollars into AI compute, because literally after March and Trump's commentary, we cannot have such a critical technology reliant on the fellow in the Oval Office deciding to shut us off or not. I mean, this would be catastrophic. So we need AI sovereignty. At the same time, because we're Canadians, we're not just worried about performance of AI, but we're worried about AI's safety. And this is probably the narrative that many of you have been following, reading up on, and getting worried about. If you think, again, conceptually about AI, it's the first technology that we've created that is actually smarter than us. And again, I mentioned earlier what fantastic benefits are going to come from that. But, oh, you're inventing something that's smarter than you. What possibly could go wrong? And so we've got a couple of great ambassadors in this space. Geoffrey Hinton, recent Nobel laureate here from U of T, Joshua Bengio in Montreal, U of A in Alberta, in Edmonton, also a center of real AI safety expertise. We need to do AI very well, but also very safely. And this could be the Canadian brand for AI, particularly when it comes to democracy, which I'll get to in a moment. And actually, the Europeans are on the same wavelength, and it was Joshua Bengio who wrote their leading text, came out 4 or 5 months ago. And so we have the expertise, we have the capability. We now need to sort of pump ourselves up a bit and say, we can do this. A few people today have already talked about this, and I am wholeheartedly bought in this notion that the information space is at risk. A number of people talked about the dangers posed to democracy, particularly through social media. Again, Homer Dixon went through the list and talked about it really, really well. AI just exacerbates that problem because it puts disinformation now on steroids. So what we have to do, and we have to do it very, very quickly, is if the US is going down a dark road, which it seems it is, I'm not 100% sure yet whether it's irredeemable. They haven't pulled out of NATO. They will be at the G7 in Alberta in June. They haven't pulled out of NORAD. Now, maybe all of that's going to come in May once the new prime minister is in office. But whether they will proceed down that dark path to full-on authoritarianism or whether they're redeemable, it's clear that the other democracies, Europe, and our German ambassador spoke very eloquently about this. Europe absolutely is a hub of democratic values. So is Canada. And then so are South Korea. They went through a blip, but like the Nixon blip, the recovery from the martial law declaration in Korea was a good sign that democracy withstood the test. So South Korea, Japan, Thailand, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, you add all that up together, I call it the fourth pole. And because we've got to reach out to a younger generation, I've got the line, may the fourth be with you. This is how we're going to brand it in certain demographics. That group of democracies, about 50 countries, is about 34 trillion of GDP. The US is 31, so it's more than the US. It's about, depending on how you count it, 800, 900 million people, etc. They need their own social media platform, and maybe a couple. X is just irredeemable. Meta is especially now that they're kowtowing and taking the knee in front of Trump. All the US social media sites are gone, at least for 4 years. Blue Sky is a precedent. Again, if you've not been to Blue Sky, check it out. But ideally, we would get a Canadian, European, Asian, democratic social media platform. We need to invest in more curated journalism. Josh Rogan is not curated journalism. If you want to understand that 18 to 30-year-old male demographic in the US, listen to the Josh Rogan interview of Trump 6 days before the election last November. Joe Rogan, sorry, not Josh. Take one of those little airline barf bags with you into the room. It's 3 hours long. This is, consider it like you're going to do this for democracy improvement and development. It is awful, but 44 million listen to it, and it skews to that 18 to 30-year-old male. And if you look at the numbers, it wasn't a landslide. It was very close as an election. But this is what we're up against. The New York Times is still there. The Washington Post is sliding a bit because of Bezos having to, again, take the knee and so forth. We also need fact-checking organizations in Canada. Quebec's not bad. They've got 3 English Canadas on shakier ground. Our best fact-checker got hired away by CNN, so that's great, but we now have to backfill. And, you know, media literacy. We have to, from the youngest age to every stage of the education process, to the elderly, we just have to keep pounding away. And again, little countries that have big aggrandizing neighbors are really good examples for their programs. So Estonia's got a really good one going vis-a-vis Russia. Taiwan, they get about 112 cyber attacks a day. It's really astounding. And then depending on how you define cyber attack, it could be in the tens of thousands as it multiplies. So there's stuff we have to do in the info space. And then for our own national security, and Carney's already talked about this, the F-35 fighter jet, we just can't take delivery of that plane. Most of these large weapon systems now cannot come to us from the US because they're all driven by software, they're all driven by AI, and even if there isn't a kill switch today, Lockheed Martin has made it very clear on the F-35 that its software, which is about 16 million lines of code, that's for just the ground systems. The lines of code in the plane are about 8 million lines of code. Those are staying in Texas in terms of the crown jewels, and we're not going to get a copy. So Portugal has already pulled out of the F-35. We have to follow them and say goodbye. And we have to look at weapon systems from countries that aren't posing a threat to our very sovereignty, and that's particularly the Swedes and the French. And it's the same with air defense. With radar, we made a good decision. We chose an Australian company. So there are ways of building with this fourth pole. If you think of I call it the A3 now, Russia, China, and the US, the 3 autocracies. So G7 is now becoming the A3. And then the Global Democracy Alliance, which is this fourth pole. There's a lot of capability there. But for us, it's going to be a tremendous change because we've been going north-south since World War II, and now we've got to think east-west, and not just Europe, but also the democracies in Asia. And this is going to be very, very difficult for us. I'm giving a talk at the Canadian Forces College to our sort of captains, colonels, and so on. And I think I'm going to get a huge response, and it might be negative, because they've been brought up and trained in the Canadian military to be literally interchangeable with the United States. And that now all has to change. So I'll leave you with a graphic. Do you know what it is? It's a porcupine. And I'm going against, Canadian messaging here, because we're all about the beaver. And I love the beaver. But this is what Canada has to become. We have to become really tough. We're not huge, but we have to become tough. And it's going to be difficult, but I think that's a positive message, that we can become it if we embrace AI, if we do it safely, if we become leading edge. We can absolutely be part of this democracy alliance and be real, co-leaders of it. So, what a positive message to end on.
You bursting with optimism. I just don't know what to tell you. This is the message we all needed. Let's take, if we have time for a couple of questions, we'll go very quickly and then send you off to your cash bar promptly, if anyone has. Just a bar. Well, that's the optimistic note for the day.
We'll make that one question.
I have a question for George, if I could. Since we're just talking about AI, and I know you kind of left on the note of if we become a leader. And I guess I would like your thoughts to just reconcile that with the fact that Canada historically has been a leader and arguably still is, if not in the top 3, top 5, and certainly in the intellectual space and the innovation space. You pointed out, Hinton being a Nobel laureate, and of course, having taught right here at U of T. So I'm just curious, in your mind, what leadership means. And I certainly know that Canada can do better in that respect, and that we probably don't invest as much as we should, and we're woefully underprepared with respect to the compute power we need to actually realize the potential that we have with AI, in the AI space. So I'd just like your thoughts on what you mean by leadership in a few maybe clearer terms going forward.
Yeah, the challenge that we have, and this is what I do in the Cold War book, is I go through, various countries and I measure up their capabilities. And the issue that we have is that the United States is simply so dominant in technology, in financing. So even relative to China, there was a piece the other day, Alibaba, one of the leading, sort of the big social platforms in China, is putting 16 billion US into the compute infrastructure area next year. Amazon's putting 100 billion US, just Amazon. Microsoft's at 80 billion. Google's at 65 billion. I mean, the numbers are huge. So the Canadian government in its last budget earmarked $2.4 million for AI infrastructure, or billion rather. And, it's a good number in a sense, but it's a rounding error on the American. So leadership means knowing what not to do, which is really hard, right? Because usually the prime minister wants to please everybody, and that's how you get to a $65 billion annual deficit. But here, you've got to really be, surgical strike precise about we're going to build and leverage, hopefully, a lot of pension fund money. So it's that kind of leadership, but I like the idea of citizens' assembly and so on. Get some people in a room who can help you work out how you're going to get to that end result. It can't just be one or two people whispering in the new government's ear. But it's tough because the US is such a dominant player globally. In the book, I call them the indispensable democracy. I warn at the end, now, on the other hand, if Trump goes rogue, watch out. So my worst case came true. And by the way, the last thing that means, he's legitimizing Turkey doing what it's doing if you followed them the last few weeks. He's going to legitimize country after country that's on the borderline to go over the edge. So this American shift is massive.
This is as much a comment as a question, and I want to start by saying, and this is about citizens' assemblies. I'm very pleased to hear the positive result of what happened in Ireland, but my message is that we've been through something like that here in Toronto for years, and it hasn't worked at all. Has been a vibrant community activism on planning issues that started 20, 30 years ago, that has a network across the city of citizens groups in neighborhoods that have fought planning issues, zoning issues, rent issues, all kinds of things at city council. And in the last 10 years, that has all been shut down. It's been shut down in various little steps at what we called the OMB, how citizens were shut out of that, made too expensive. They've been shut down in meetings that are supposed to consider these things. And maybe the nasty hook for this panel is that one of the ways this gets shut down is that these citizens' meetings are turned into Zoom meetings. And you go to a Zoom meeting, you don't know who else is at that meeting because the people who control the meeting won't tell you. If you ask who's there, they won't tell you. You can't make a comment to the meeting. The AI, and the AI is too high, this is just Zoom technology, is used to defeat the citizen participation. It's not a promising technology. From the provincial level down, step by step, citizens have been shut out of decision making where their thoughts should be useful, they were useful, and they're not heard anymore. So that's, as I started saying, I'm glad you won in Ireland, but the model that I've been through for 20 years in Toronto is a different message.
I suppose we need to put these types of democratic innovations into context. So I certainly don't think deliberative mini-publics and citizens' assemblies and so forth are some sort of silver bullet. I think they can play an important role, but they are, of course, process dependent. So there have been a variety of different experiments around the world that have come under this umbrella term deliberative mini-public. Some of them have not been very inclusive and deliberative, others have. So I think it's a constant evolution, it's a constant work in progress. They also aren't going to do much good unless there's some political buy-in to take them seriously and to meaningfully incorporate what they have to say into our broader architecture. One thing that Ireland has done well, I think, in that by having these successive citizens' assemblies at national level over more than a decade, familiarity with the process has grown, and enthusiasm for participation in them has grown as well. So one of the challenges is we don't just want to attract people who are very civically minded, we actually want to really try and gather a representative sample of people, and perhaps the most representative among us are those who don't have the time, energy, or inclination to participate in the first place. But as familiarity has grown with them in Ireland, trust levels, and we've talked about trust in different institutions, has generally grown. But we also have had differing levels of government uptake. We had a citizens' assembly on gender equality, which actually began during the pandemic, had to move completely onto Zoom when the pandemic took off. It worked well. It produced recommendations which were passed to a parliamentary committee, and ultimately we had 2 constitutional referendums last year in which the government significantly departed from the recommendations of the citizens' assembly. And those 2 referendums failed abysmally. And people said, is this the end of citizens' assemblies in Ireland? And I think really it's more of an example of the perils of not taking them seriously and expecting citizens to participate and then not doing anything with the recommendations. So I think if we want to ask our citizens to be engaged and to have energy, then we need to take them seriously when they do participate in that way. But I very much take what you said to heart.
Let me maybe just use my moderator's prerogative to ask the last question. Let me expand on that question and turn it over to the whole group. I mean, on the one hand, I think the insights from today's panels are that the more you engage with people in person and get them to actually discuss these issues, make space for these social conversations, face-to-face, et cetera, the better it's going to be. The more people are willing to change their minds, to be cordial, civil to each other, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, what you see is through online anonymity, et cetera, it makes the conversations worse, it polarizes the debate, and it gives undue power to just a few people who sort of take over the entire conversation. So we know what we need to do, but then on the other hand, there's just reality, which is that more and more our heads are in our phones, more and more are we relying on automated, artificial means, I guess, to come to our answers and to tell us the truth. And the less and less, I mean, people aren't socializing as much, right? There's social studies that come out every once in a while. People aren't socializing, they're not going to bars, they're not meeting real people anymore, they're chatting on their phones the whole time. And that's just such a pressure, and it's not getting better. And sure, we can say, well, we know the answer, we need to do less of it, but the reality is we're not, and it doesn't seem like we're going in the right direction on that. So I don't know what your insights are as to how you get away from that. Is it just, let's just make a concerted effort and let's talk to each other some more, or are we doomed and are we just going to keep on going down that spiral?
I can start with that. Somebody in the audience referenced Robert Putnam today, right? So for a long time, we've known that there's been a decline of third spaces in our societies. And then during the pandemic, they completely disappeared, right? And so much had to be online, and that's not the same thing. It's okay in certain contexts in some ways, somehow, but we haven't really invested, nurtured, and supported third spaces. Public libraries are a really important area for us to emphasize. It's one of the few spaces you can go in society where you're not a customer, you're just an active citizen, you're a patron, anyone can be there anytime, you don't have to buy something. And so third spaces, we're not sure how to handle it anymore. We cut everything off during the pandemic, and now we're still figuring out how to come together and be back again, and what fills that void, and how do we make that readily available and accessible to people. But at the same time, in these types of conversations, we'll hear a deriding of the young, they're so disengaged, and the public is just on their phones, and that's not how you meant it, Nicholas. But well, there's a reason for that, and it's because a political establishment has not sufficiently respectfully been engaging with the electorate. It's been very top-down, arrogant, dismissive. Like we heard this earlier from the ambassador as well. Very selective high-mindedness, and now there's a reason why people are turning to Joe, not Josh Rogan, right? Because where are they supposed to go? And they're being funneled in these spaces. People are vulnerable and susceptible to that because the side that's pro-democracy is not responding the way it should. And it's really hard in Canada for us to contend with failure and adopt a continuous improvement mindset. It's not our culture. We're kind of a little too repressed for that. And I think that we need to think in a courageous and ambitious fashion right now about what we actually want. And when we really get down to it, people just want to come together to solve problems. The will is there. We just did a library series in 4 different cities across the country. 200 people came to each of those things because people want somewhere to go. Look at how many people came out to this today. So perhaps it's not as dire as we think it is. We should be mindful about how many polls we see that are asking us about how polarized we are. What if the polling question is, would you like to be together a little more? And so what data are we using to make sense of this moment, and how can we be responsive in a very just grounded, practical way?
Sasha, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on these points as well. When I read numbers like 60% of Canadians visited a museum once in the past 12 months, I said, okay, this could be read 2 ways. One, it's a really good number. 60%, it's the majority. On the other hand, is once in 12 months, and what about the other 40%? So I don't think we have the participation rates that we need, and we have the participation and intent to visit rates among those who are willing to visit. There are non-visitors wanting to visit, and non-visitors who never want to visit. And how does this break down from an electoral perspective? How does this break down from from a post-liberal perspective as well? So I'm really wondering about that. And then also part of this is the biggest form of cultural consumption. I mean, let me start differently. When you look at sort of statistics put out by the Alliance of American Museums, which is the U.S. Museum Association, they say more people come to museums than go to football games. Great. How many people are actually on platform apps and so on? How many people are actually doing gaming? These are the biggest forms of cultural consumption at the moment. And so we talk a lot about public funding for culture in this country and elsewhere and say it's not enough. At the same time, we're not regulating or having a consolidated effort towards regulating platform companies where culture policy is in effect made. So we actually don't have. So I hope that dovetails with what you're saying, because we actually don't have the public policy will to regulate and have an answer to those tools that in effect also have then an impact on the way in which we want to structure our democracy. Don't think that's an uplifting note, but yeah.
But ultimately, I think it's a mix. The phrase mobilization came up a lot in your panel. And I think you need a hybrid solution. So some Zoom, especially if Zoom is done well, and now with AI tools to make the Zoom better, I think that's important. At the same time, there's nothing like rubbing elbows with Josh, Joe, Sabrina, whomever, or what's going to happen in the free bar in 3 minutes. So you have to get the mix right. What the autocrats are doing, though, is they're going to the other end of the continuum. So China has built, with AI, the most oppressive surveillance state in the world, but they've also exported that system to 60 other countries. So the autocracies today, especially in China, but also in Russia, they make earlier autocrats sort of pale in comparison. This is now a technology-infused control system. So that municipal council, if they really come at it from a Canadian perspective and want to encourage participation, first of all, they'd allow for hybrid, but even the online can be done in a way that makes the experience sort of much better. Or they can use it in a way that, frankly, is counterproductive. So at least this group now knows to demand better.
So thank you to the panel. A warm hand of applause. Emily is going to come and deliver closing remarks, and while she's getting here, I'll just say, if you enjoyed this event, do 3 things. One is keep on coming to Massey, because I don't think I've ever had a bad event at Massey. They're always interesting. You meet interesting people. The second thing is talk to Peter Bureau about his Section 1 endeavor, because it's a very, very important thing to do. He needs your help and your support. And the third thing is become a Canadian International Council member. So it's basically Canada's Chatham House. We haven't raised fees in like 15 years. It's embarrassing. $75 to be a member for the year. You get tons of conversations and discussions on Canada's role internationally. $20 for students, so really you're taking money from us. And stay involved. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we're over time, so I'll keep this brief. My name is Emily Mockler, and I'm the Director of Programs and Partnerships here at Massey College. I'd like to take a moment on behalf of Massey to extend our sincere thanks for everyone who made today possible. To our co-sponsors, Section 1 and the Canadian International Council, thank you. Peter, thank you. Peter Bureau, thank you for your tireless efforts in pulling today together, for your inspiring keynote. Thank you. That really set the tone for the conversations that followed throughout the day. To John English and Nicolas Rouleau, thank you for your generous partnership and for your excellent contributions both behind the scenes and on stage as panelists and moderators. To Senior Fellow Thomas Homer-Dixon, I know he had to leave early, but we would really like to thank him for the compelling and thought-provoking afternoon keynote. To all of our distinguished panelists, thank you for sharing your wisdom and your time with us and experience. And finally, thank you to all of us, all of you in the audience, for joining us and being so generous with your time and engagement. I think now more than ever, it's so vital that we come together and reflect and discuss on the challenges facing liberal democracy, not just here in Canada, but around the world. Events like today remind us the power of dialogue, collaboration, and shared purpose in strengthening institutions and values we hold dear. So we recorded today's session. I encourage you to share it widely with your networks. And now I'm going to invite you to the upper library for a reception. Thank you.
Thank you to Emily Mockler for her this day.